Welcome again to yet another edition of our LGBTQI plus discussions. And today we are doing a conclusion of our last three episodes plus an introduction. And so the conclusion I have labeled it the democracy and human rights nonsense, which is really a focus of the tool as a tool of promoting white privilege and natural commercialization. So these are like four topics in one, the focus in which all the episodes have touched on. And of course, it is democracy because the people who are seen as perpetuating the destruction of traditional culture are basically the people from the West who are really not every culture from the West, but specifically the white culture. And so it is seen as a white supremacist agenda. And so again, it is, let me say, a puzzle or a paradox when the the white supremacists are advocates of democracy, and they force governments into democratic government. It is again a quagmire, a confusion, because democracy is the will of the majority, the people of the land. And so again, they're the people who push the idea of human rights, but it is human rights from their lens. They don't really see other cultures as having any tendency of human rights. And of course, they don't appreciate what other cultures also may bring into the fore in terms of how these cultures for very many years have been able to protect life and protect decency, and of course the long history of how like for example the African culture has been able to organize her society. Again, these are the same people, whatever I mentioned as the white privilege is, for example, when you go to any supermarket around the world, you will find food that is fit for any white person. Go to any country, even in Somali, if they have a supermarket on the shelves, you'll find food that will fit a white person. But if you go to any supermarket around the world, you won't find an African food. And so this is just one example. And of course, all these democracy and human rights agenda, and of course, the commercialization of agriculture, and all these things, they all benefit the superpowers and the superpowers of this world, except China, though also China is becoming imperialistic, but it is the white imperialism that all these systems serve. And so even the destruction of nature, it started during the Industrial Revolution. And who are the owners of Industrial Revolution? It is the white man from Europe. And of course, I'll give you a short history about Kenya and how the white man entered the society and how he viewed the society, and of course claiming that they discovered a lot of things, and that's why today we are grappling with the idea that the white man again is discovering the LGBTQI plus, while these people have been in very many communities, even in Africa. It's only that their business is private. Now, I'll also shed some light on how the white man has been able to imperialize or to cause imperialism around the world to indigenous nations. And so with that, we'll be able to conclude what is this LGBTQ agenda as brought by the white person, and how what it means and how will it impact our society. And so we will start with Macmillan. Macmillan came to Kenya and settled in Mount Kilimambogo, which basically means the mountain of buffaloes. It is along Thika Road today, and he farmed at a farm that is called today Juja Farm. It was a sisal farm, and so Macmillan has a library bearing his name after he passed on in the capital of Nairobi. But Macmillan in his book describes his workers, who were mainly Kikuyus and Kambas, as savages. So this is how the white man saw Africans. And so when the missionaries came, or rather, probably Macmillan came after the missionaries, because the early missionaries that came to East Africa came in 1844. And so the missionaries came to Africa basically to save Africans from savagehood. All right? So that is another perspective of the church. This is a perspective of an explorer and a settler, Macmillan. And so also you read from the US president of 1909, Roosevelt. And so Roosevelt, in the company of Heller and another guy called Hanningen, came to East Africa to actually do gaming. They used to shoot animals. This is where the name safari came in, as a tour to Africa to go and shoot animals and bring back trophies into their countries for scientific purposes. Now, President Roosevelt in East Africa did his trade of shooting animals, hunting the wild in Congo, in Khartoum, in Tanzania, and in Kenya. And in a book written, a book that is called The African Game Trail, records up to 11,400 animals killed, and they are stored in the Natural Museum of New York, the Museum of Natural History in New York. And so this is the small history of Kenyans and other Africans encountering the white man for the first time, and what was the idea of the white man towards Africans. And this is a very late history. If you read histories from 19th century, it is even worse. We were given bad names. And so this is, I'm bringing this up so that you can see even how whatever agenda is coming from the West and the money is used, and the efforts of trying to bring down the African culture, other than the two cultures dialoguing, and of course the culture that will be able to maneuver the test of time will prevail and carry the day. They are forcing their culture through the process of commercialization, which is actually a product of capitalism. And so there is a program that started probably in the 90s. It is called the Export Zone, Export Something Zone, the EPZ. And so this EPZ, it really employs a lot of people, around 60,000 people, but they are laying down workers. Today, because the program was an imperialist program. Even the clothes that are rejected by the quantity or the quality assurer, they are not even sold to Africans. Africans are brought mitumbas, clothes of white people who have stopped wearing them or they are dead. And so it's still part of the imperialism that we are talking about. And so when you move towards the idea of Vision 2030, you'll find that the EPZ is really entrenched as an economic model of pushing our economy towards the middle income level. But it is facing financial crisis because America is facing financial crisis. Banks are being put under receivership. The Silicon Valley banks are really bankrupt. And of course, the investment in the treasury bills and bonds in the US is really not working. Nothing is working. Look at the strikes that are happening in Europe. You go to Britain, almost every worker from every sector is on a strike. Go to France. People have been striking since last year, and so there is the West is facing a calamity that is natural and it is within its own territory. So it is not external, and so we really need to look at these things from the perspective that they are either imperialistic or they are a dialogue. If it is a dialogue, money is not needed. But if it is imperialistic, money is needed. So you look during colonialism and slavery, resources were taken from us, but money was pumped, but a lot of resources that were not commensurate to the money that was pumped into the education and the medical care, and of course investing into the railway and government offices in Africa was not commensurate with the resources that they took away from Africa. Now today, they are bringing in a culture, what they call culture clash, but it is artificial, it is not natural. Now, other questions that we may want to ask ourselves is really, could this be a target, a psychological war that since it has taken too long for the West to control the world population, and of course to reduce the African population in the pretext that the population is growing more than the economy, while Africans hold almost half of the world resources that are needed for the industries. It is really a double speak. Again, if you ask a question, is all this pumping money into certain causes in Africa, is it really to reduce poverty? And why should we be poor while we hold all these resources? So there are very many questions that are really unanswered. And of course, finally, I know that the American history and the the British history, and of course the French and the German, their history are not as long as that of Africa and other indigenous countries and First Nations across the continents. But really, that's why they are good in opening up these societies, these cultures, because for them, since they are individualistic, they are able to be thought through and be analyzed, and of course set them up as an agenda. And that's why you see even technology is driving into individualism. Anything that comes from the West drives communal societies or cultures into individualism. And that's why they are good in opening up the society by discussing issues that were not really comfortable for traditional societies to discuss. But for them, also, they have issues that they can't discuss. You look at the history of the world, you'll find that we have been having the history of the West for example, in Europe, around 13th and 14th century, they they were persecuting the community that we called Romas. Romas now settle in Romania. Before they were accepted as Europeans, they were thought to have migrated from Egypt, and so they were killed by Nazis. They were put in the concentration camps, and of course they were dispersed across Africa and dispersed across America, and of course their origins, because they have dark skin and very black hair, so they were thought that they were not white people, and so they faced the wrath of imperialism, the one that I'm talking about. And so they were not really fit for the white privilege. And so when you continue with the history of the world, you will also realize that there are very many people who have suffered in the hands of the white supremacists. And of course, the white culture, with its component, like I said, it has the rugged individualism that surrounds their value and, of course, their beliefs. And they believe that this individualistic tendency help them to be high assertive, to be responsible, and of course to be curious. And that's why they always want to put it into test and always have a competition to see who is the best of the best. And of course they claim that they are good in acting. And so that's why they tend to control nature, and that's why in our topic we are talking about commercialization of nature. And so it is a struggle. Even their communication is actually literal. They don't approve of oral communication. It has to be literal, and if it is oral, it has to be borrowed from the literal process of arriving to conclusion. And of course there is the direct contact of eyes, and of course their talks is based on history, because their history is so short. That's why the years are significant to justify where their history begins from. And of course they are so keen on time, and that's why they have schedules. They can read from the past, they can start a history from a certain year, and of course they can learn from it and be able to schedule for the future. And this tendency is one that removes God in the picture of anything that human beings purport to do. And of course, when you look at the history, they romanticize war. So you'll find many annals of history talking about a certain war, the First World War, the Second World War, while they know very well that these world wars were never world wars. They were just either continental wars, or they were just international wars, but they were not world wars. Africa was not fighting Asia, especially Pacific or Indian Asia was not fighting. The Americas were not fighting. And so it was just Europeans who have migrated from here and there, and probably the last Second World War, which involved Japan and America, just to prove, because the Americans wanted to get into the picture, and as the latest colonialist and imperialist. And so you will find that they have also this idea of immigration. For them, when they move from one point to another point, it is not a bad thing. But for other people, they moved and they set laws so other peoples cannot move. They looted and they set laws so that other people cannot loot. And that's why poverty is an artificial making of the superpower through the imperialistic mentality towards countries that they stole from. So if you are as afraid of another person, it's because you know what you did to them and you fear that they may want to retaliate. And so that's why there are so many laws, and so many laws that prevents Africans, prevents Asians and Americas, and also the Europeans and Asians from migrating to the West, to Europe and to North America, and so on and so forth. The idea of family is nuclear family, and that's why they keep it so small. And that's why the idea of LGBTQ as the new paradigm of household, it really makes sense, because you are reducing it. It is in consonant with the population control, because if you can reduce the family members, it means that resources will be enough if for the few who will be facing the future. So they have a Protestant work ethic, whereby they have slogans that hard work pays. It is an American or a white man's cultural view. And of course, they have they talk about saving, so that you delay your gratification so that you can enjoy later. They also talk of the continuous improvement, so that's why they are not afraid of making errors. So they can destroy here, as long as they will find a solution and patch up the solution tomorrow. So this is the European idea. And so they look at everything from a lineal perspective. They like to believe that they are rational and objective. And of course, they emphasize on scientific methods of arriving to a conclusion. They look at everything from a position of cause and effect, a relation. So nothing can happen without a cause. And of course, they look at also the dual idea of thinking. I think I mentioned that in our previous segments. And of course, they also have power and status to approve what they have acquired. And of course, the ownership, the strong sense of ownership, private ownership, for that matter. And of course, the economic possession, and they believe in system, their own system. They don't believe in other people's system, and that's why African and other cultures are being destroyed, because they don't believe in them. And of course, they also believe in what we call aesthetics. For example, the music, the culture. For them, beauty is blonde hair, blue eyes, thin and young women. Men should be athletic, though Africans beat them in very many athletic games. And so economic status, and they crave around Christianity as their religion. I wonder what happened to the white man's religion. No, because Christianity is a Palestinian religion. And so with those few remarks, join me again as we continue in the next segment, in this conclusion, whereby I'm going to talk now about other people who invaded, and of course their cultures disrupted by the white supremacist imperialism. Thank you, and see you shortly.